In the late 19th century, Africa was not empty, it was not chaotic, and it was not waiting to be claimed. Yet in 1884, in a quiet room in Berlin, powerful European nations gathered to decide Africa's future without a single African present. What followed was not just a meeting, it was one of the most consequential political decisions in modern history. This is the story of the Berlin Conference and how it carved Africa into the shape we recognize today. Before Europe drew borders, Africa already had them, just not on paper. The continent was home to great civilizations like the Ashanti Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, and the Kingdom of Congo. Further east, Ethiopia stood as an ancient kingdom, alongside Buganda and the Swahili city-states. In the south, the Zulu Kingdom commanded vast territories. These societies had complex political systems, diplomacy, vibrant trade networks, and established laws. Borders existed, but they were fluid, shaped by culture, language, trade, and alliances, not by straight lines drawn on a map. Europe knew this, and they chose to ignore it. So, why did Europe suddenly want Africa? By the late 1800s, Europe was in the full swing of the Industrial Revolution. Factories were hungry for raw materials, rubber, palm oil, copper, gold, and ivory, and Africa had these resources in abundance. But it wasn't just about economics. European powers were locked in a fierce competition for prestige. Colonies meant power, and power meant survival in Europe's tangled web of political rivalries. However, this uncontrolled expansion created a serious risk of war, not with Africans, but among the European nations themselves. To avoid conflict, they chose negotiation, deciding the fate of an entire continent without consulting a single person who lived there. The Berlin Conference began in 1884 and lasted into 1885. Hosted by the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, 14 countries attended, including Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Belgium. Notably absent was any African ruler, diplomat, or representative. The conference established rules for claiming African land. The most important of these was the principle of effective occupation, which meant a nation had to prove it could control the territory it claimed. It also settled disputes over control of major rivers and coastlines. In essence, Africa was treated not as a continent of people and nations, but as a giant resource map to be divided up. With the rules established, European diplomats got to work with rulers and pencils. They drew borders across the map of Africa, often in perfectly straight lines that completely disregarded the reality on the ground. These artificial lines sliced through ethnic groups, separated communities that spoke the same language, and ignored religious boundaries. They split historic kingdoms and forced long-standing rivals into the same newly formed colonies. The borders made perfect sense on a piece of paper in a room in Berlin. They made absolutely no sense in the villages, markets, and farmlands of Africa, and many of the modern borders we see on the continent today still follow these exact lines. After the conference, Europe rushed to make its claims a reality. This period became known as the Scramble for Africa. It was a time of military conquest, forced labor, and the seizure of land. New tax systems were brutally enforced to fund the colonial administrations, and traditional forms of governance were dismantled. Some African societies resisted fiercely. Leaders like Samori Toure in West Africa, along with the Zulu and Ashanti peoples, fought back. Ethiopia famously defeated an Italian invasion, preserving its independence. But for the most part, European military technology proved overwhelming. Colonial rule was established, and Africa's economies were rewired to serve Europe, not to benefit Africans. The effects of the Berlin Conference did not end when colonialism did. The artificial borders drawn in 1884 became a major source of instability for newly independent nations. These borders contributed to ethnic tension, civil wars, and political turmoil, as different groups found themselves competing for power within states they never chose to be part of. Many African nations inherited systems designed for extraction, not for development. This doesn't mean Africa's modern challenges are inevitable, but it does mean they are deeply rooted in this history. To understand modern Africa, we have to understand Berlin. The Berlin Conference is often taught in schools as a dry diplomatic meeting, but for Africa, it was a moment of profound silencing. Decisions about land, resources, and people were made without consent. Borders were drawn without understanding. And the consequences of those decisions were inherited by generations who never had a say in the matter. It's crucial to remember that African history does not begin with colonization, but it was violently and permanently redirected by it. The borders on a modern map of Africa are not ancient. They are recent. They were drawn in a foreign room, for foreign interests, with long-lasting effects that are still felt today. Understanding this history isn't about assigning blame, it's about finding context. And without context, the present rarely makes sense. If this history was new to you, that's because it was never meant to be common knowledge. Subscribe for more documentaries that uncover the past without distortion and without shortcuts.